version of Christianity, and the rest is history. So anytime we learn about history, well, having a cursory understanding of things is certainly better than nothing. I think it's super important to always consider what led up to that. This isn't all that happened. And the older one gets, if you're anything like me, you love to learn more and more about history. For example, with music, when I learn about the American Revolution now, or when I think about it now, I'm also able to think of what classical composers were active at the time. And what was the soundtrack of the American Revolution? And when you learn more about the culture of the time, you're ultimately much better armed to have a discussion about it. And this is probably a good time for a break, so we're going to take a short break, and we will see you on the other side. Hello, and welcome back to Andy's Philosophy Corner. This time around, we are talking about rebellion and revolution. Now, we've already mentioned several times on this podcast, many times, metaphysics. And what does that have to do with anything else you've heard in this podcast today? Well, metaphysics is one of the major branches of philosophy. And so let's just go deep for a couple minutes on what metaphysics actually is. And full disclosure, I'm just reading straight from Wikipedia. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that examines the fundamental nature of reality, including the relationship between mind and matter, between substance and attribute, and between potentiality and actuality. The word metaphysics comes from two Greek words that together literally mean after or behind or among the study of the natural. It has been suggested that the term might have been coined by a first-century editor who assembled various small selections of Aristotle's works into the treatise we now know by the name Metaphysics, another of Aristotle's works. Metaphysics studies questions related to what it is for something to exist and what types of existence there are. Metaphysics seeks to answer in an abstract and fully general manner the questions, what is there? And what is it like? Topics of metaphysical investigation include existence, objects and their properties, space and time, cause and effect, and possibility. Metaphysics is considered one of the four main branches of philosophy, along with epistemology, logic, and ethics. So, let's look at the Epistemological Foundation. Metaphysical study is conducted using deduction from that which is known a priori, something that's already happened. Like foundational mathematics, which is sometimes considered a special case of metaphysics applied to the existence of numbers, it tries to give a coherent account of the structure of the world, capable of explaining our everyday and scientific perception of the world and being free from contradictions. In mathematics, there are many different ways to define numbers. Similarly, in metaphysics, there are many different ways to define objects, properties, concepts, and other entities that are claimed to make up the world. While metaphysics may, as a special case, study the entities postulated by fundamental science such as atoms and superstrings, its core topic is the set of categories such as object, property, and causality, which those scientific theories assume. For example, claiming that electrons have charge is a scientific theory, while exploring what it means for electrons to be, or at least to be perceived as, objects, charge to be a property, and for both to exist in a topological entity called space, is the task of metaphysics. There are two broad stances about what is the world studied by metaphysics. According to metaphysical realism, the objects studied by metaphysics exist independently of any observer, so that the subject is the most fundamental of all sciences. Metaphysical anti-realism, on the other hand, assumes that the objects studied by metaphysics exist inside the mind of an observer, so the subject becomes a form of introspection and conceptual analysis. This position is of more recent origin, and end quote. I'm going to start to wonder a little bit about metaphysical anti-realism, because I'm wondering if metaphysical anti-realism has any ties to third generation to postmodernism at all. So it's my next research subject. Some philosophers, notably Kant, there you go, I saw it coming, discuss both of these worlds and what can be inferred about each one. Some, such as the logical positivists and many scientists, reject the metaphysical realism as meaningless and unverifiable. Others reply that this criticism also applies to any type of knowledge, including hard science, which claims to describe anything other than the contents of human perception, and thus that the world of perception is the objective world in some sense. Metaphysics itself usually assumes that some stance has been taken on these questions and that it may proceed independently of the choice, the question of which stance to take belongs instead to another branch of philosophy, epistemology. So let's talk about metaphysical anti-realism for just a moment. One kind of metaphysical anti-realism maintains a skepticism about the physical world, arguing either 1, that nothing exists outside of the mind, or 2, that we would have no access to a mind-independent reality, even if it exists. The latter case often takes the form of a denial of the idea that we can have unconceptualized experiences. Conversely, most realists, indirect realists, hold that perceptions or sense data are caused by mind-independent objects, but this introduces the possibility of another kind of skepticism, since our understanding of causality is that the same effect can be produced by multiple causes. There is a lack of determinacy about what one is really perceiving, as in the brain in a vat scenario. The main alternative to this sort of metaphysical anti-realism is metaphysical realism. Now, in philosophy, the brain in a vat is a scenario used in a variety of thought experiments intended to draw out certain features of human conceptions of knowledge, reality, truth, mind, consciousness, and meaning. It is a modern incarnation of René Descartes' evil demon thought experiment, and I don't want to get too far off subject. But the brain in a vat scenario is not that unlike Plato's cave scenario, where I don't know if this will be described too well visually. Here, I'll draw a chart. Hey, can everybody see this? Okay, good. Well, Plato's cave, which you may have heard before, and if God forbid there's any philosophy professors listening, they'll think I'm a complete idiot. But anyway, imagine people below ground in a cave, and they're chained inside the cave, and the only light they can see is their own shadows. Well, they can just see their own shadows projected onto the wall, and other shadows projected onto the wall from lights that are behind them onto this wall. And so the idea is that you couldn't, and if someone lived their whole life that way, you couldn't just take them outside of the cave and expect them to survive in the real world after they've been in the fake world, so to speak, for a long time. And not a horrible time to mention the Matrix scenario, where you perceive everything and everything seems real and looks real and tastes real because all of your senses are being satisfied. All of your senses make sense, but what you don't know is that outside of your five senses, there's an entire universe waiting out there. So, getting back to metaphysical anti-realism here, on a more abstract level, model theoretic anti-realist arguments hold that a given set of symbols in a theory can be mapped onto any number of sets of real-world objects, each set being a model of the theory, provided the relationship between the object is the same. So, ponder that for a moment. When you study metaphysics and you study how different objects and groups work together over time, you could study one set of groups in their environment, learn their principles of interaction, and then apply those same principles to a completely different group and environment and have those same principles work. In ancient Greek philosophy, nominalist or anti-realist doctrines about universals were proposed by the Stoics, especially Chrysippus, Chrysippus. In early modern philosophy, conceptualist anti-realist doctrines about universals were proposed by thinkers like René Descartes, John Locke, Baruch Spinoza, Leibniz, Berkeley, and Hume. In late modern philosophy, anti-realist doctrines about knowledge were proposed by the German idealist Hegel. Hegel was a proponent of what is now called inferentialism. Wow, lots of big words on this show. Getting your money's worth. He believed that the ground for axioms and the foundation for the validity of the inferences are the right consequences, and that the axioms do not explain the consequence. Kant and Hegel held conceptualist views about universals. In contemporary philosophy, anti-realism was reviewed in the form of empirio-criticism, logical positivism, semantic anti-realism, and scientific instrumentalism. Whew. Boy, that's a mouthful. Let me get back to some 2- and 3-syllable words here for a second, if I can. So, how we look at the world obviously shapes our world. In Star Wars, Qui-Gon tells a very young Anakin Skywalker, our perception determines our reality. If any of you have ever raised a child, you've tried to think of ways to convey things you have learned in order to help the person that you love. Something I've always told my child is, 1, don't believe everything you hear. And secondly, always think for yourself. So we've strayed a bit far from whiskey, which, for purely philosophical purposes, I'm going to have a sip of whiskey because I'd feel guilty. I'd feel like I wasn't doing my best I feel like I wasn't doing my best if I did a podcast about whiskey.